The deputies came for me on the fourth morning of my marriage, before the dew had burned off the porch rail, and I went down the steps still buttoning my shirt with Marian's voice climbing behind me. I remember the cold ring of the manacle more than I remember my own name being read off the warrant, and I remember her hand catching the back of my coat and not letting go until a man I'd known since boyhood pried her loose finger by finger. They told her to stand back. They told her it was rustling, that I'd run 40 head of her father's beeves up into the Owl Creek hills and sold them across the line, and that the brands had been found altered in my own corral with my own running iron lying in the ash. None of it was true. I want to put that down plain at the start, because a man who tells you a thing happened to him is bound to claim he was wronged, and you've a right to be suspicious. But I was wronged, and it took me the better part of my life to set it right. And by the time I did, I was an old man telling a young girl I was her father. I'll get to her, let me tell it the way it came. I was 22 that spring, and I had nothing but a good seat on a horse and a name with no money under it. Calder. My people had been freighters who'd lost their wagons to a flooded ford and never climbed back up, and by the time I was grown, there wasn't a Calder left in the territory but me. I hired on at the Doss Range below Antelope Flat because Harlan Doss paid wages on the first of the month and didn't ask where a man had been, and I'd have ridden for the devil himself if he paid on the first. What I hadn't counted on was Marian. She was Doss's only living child, and she ran his books better than the foreman ran his cattle, and the first time I saw her, she was standing in the yard arguing with a freight agent about a short load and winning, and the agent twice her size and going red in the face. She had her father's stubborn jaw and none of his meanness, which is a thing I've come to believe a person can be born with, the way you can be born with one blue eye and one brown. She looked at me sorting tack by the barn and asked me did I always work that slow or was I making a show of it for her benefit, and I said neither, that I was just admiring how a man could lose an argument to a woman in his own yard, and she laughed before she could stop herself, and that was the whole of it. That was the beginning and the end. I'd have gone to the gallows for the sound of that laugh, and as it turned out I went somewhere worse and stayed longer. Her father would not have me. I'll not pretend that surprised either of us. Harlan Doss had built up from one wagon to 40,000 acres by the grace of God and the spine of a snapping turtle, and he meant his daughter to marry land, not a cowhand who owned a saddle and a coat. He told me so himself, leaning on a corral rail with a quirt across his knee, friendly as you please, the way a man is friendly when he's certain he holds every card. He said he'd not see her hitched to a saddle tramp, that he'd raised her too well for that, and that if I had any decency I'd draw my wages and ride before I shamed her. I told him I'd ride the day she told me to and not a day before. He nodded like I'd confirmed something he already suspected about me, and he was smiling when he walked away, and I should have read that smile better than I did. Marian and I were married in the spring by a circuit preacher named Stoke in the front room of a widow's house in Cedar Bluff, with the widow and the preacher's wife for witnesses, and a jar of bluebells on the table, because Marian wouldn't be married without flowers, and bluebells were what the season gave. We had no money for a ring. I'd traded my second pair of boots in town for a thin gold band that turned out to be more brass than gold, and it went green on her finger inside a month, and she wore it green and would not have a better one. Said a poor ring honestly come by was worth more than a rich one bought with a lie, and I've thought on that sentence 10,000 nights since and never once found the bottom of it. We had 4 days. I want you to understand that. 4 days in a line shack on the far edge of the Doss Range that Marian's father didn't ride to anymore. 4 days of her teaching me to cook a thing besides bacon and me teaching her to throw a loop she didn't need. 4 days of planning how we'd tell him and where we'd go when he turned us out, which we knew he would. On the 4th morning the deputies came. It was Vince Sorrell who put me there. I didn't know it then. Sorrell was Doss's foreman, a tall, flat-eyed man who wanted the Doss Range the only way a hired man could come to want it, which was through the daughter, and he'd watched Marian look at me across the yard for a season, and decided I was a weed in his field. He was the one who found the altered brands. He was the one who swore he'd seen me drive the beeves north. He was the one whose running iron it truly was, salted into my corral while I was 4 days married in a line shack 12 miles off. And he stood up in the territorial court in his good coat, and told it so smooth and sorrowful that even I half believed him. And the judge gave me 12 years at Stony Lick for a crime that put no money in my pocket and no beef on any plate. And Vince Sorrow watched them lead me out, and did not once meet my eye. Marion was in that courtroom. She had stood up to speak for me, and her father had stood up faster and said she was a girl out of her head over a tramp and not to be heeded. And the judge, who owed Harlan Doss money the way half the territory owed Harlan Doss money, had heeded him. The last I saw of my wife for 15 years was her face turned back over her shoulder as they marched me down the aisle, white as a peeled stick, mouthing a word I couldn't hear over the irons. I have spent a great portion of my life guessing at that word. I think now it was wait. I did. God knows I did. What neither of us knew that morning, what I would not learn for the better part of a lifetime, was that she was already carrying our child. Stony Lick sat in a bend of Bad River in the dry country to the south, a stone box with a stone wall and a yard where they marched us in a circle for 1 hour out of the 24. And the rest of it I'll not dwell on, because a man my age has earned the right to leave some things in the dark where they belong. I'll tell you only what bears on the story. I'll tell you about the letters. I could write. My mother had taught me before the fever took her, sitting me at the table with a slate and refusing me supper till I'd made my letters fair, and I have blessed her for it on my knees, because it gave me the one road back to Marion that the stone walls couldn't close. Every month a man could send 1 letter out, and I sent mine. The first one I wrote was 4 pages, and I tore it up because it was all anger and no good to her. And the second I wrote slow over a week, dipping the nib in ink the color of weak coffee, and it said only that I was innocent, that I'd find a way to prove it, that she should hold the line shack money I'd left in the coffee tin, and not let her father shame her into thinking she'd wed a thief, and that I'd come back. I signed it your husband, which I'd not signed anything before, and I held it a long time before I gave it over, because once I gave it over it was out of my hands and into the world's, and I'd already learned what the world did with a thing that was out of my hands. No answer came. I told myself the mails were slow, and they were. I told myself a married woman with a hard father had 100 reasons to be careful what she put on paper, and she did. I wrote again the next month, and the next, 12 a year for the first 3 years, and not once did a word come back over that wall to me. By the second year I had built a whole woman out of the silence, a woman who'd come to her senses, who'd let her father annul a 4-day marriage to a convicted thief, who'd married land at last like she was raised to, and was glad I was gone. I hated that woman some nights with a heat that frightened me. And then I would remember the green ring she'd wear over a gold one, and the words she'd mouthed in the courtroom. And I'd know the woman I'd built was a lie I'd told myself to make the silence bearable, and I'd write again. Here is the truth I didn't have. Every letter I sent reached the Doss range, because Marion had no other address and the post went where the post had always gone, to the big house at Antelope Flat. And every letter that came to that house, Harlan Doss took off the freight wagon himself, and read, and burned in the cook stove before his daughter rose. He told me all of it at the end, which I'll come to in the flat dying voice of a man too far gone to lie anymore, and he wept telling it. Which I had not believed he had the water in him to do. He burned 15 years of my letters one at a time, and he told his daughter I had confessed in prison, that I'd married her for the range and run off the cattle to spite him, and that I never wanted to see her or the child again. He invented a confession I never made and put it in my mouth, and he did it because he loved her in the warped way a hard man loves, which is to say, he loved the having of her more than the her of her, and he could not bear that she'd chosen a tramp over everything he'd broken his back to build. She didn't believe him. I'll give her that and more. She didn't believe him for a year, and then for a year she half believed him, and then the baby came and there was a child to feed and a father holding the purse strings, and somewhere in their belief stopped being something she could afford. But she never married Vince Sorrel, who pressed his suit hard once the verdict was in, and Das pushing him at her like a remedy. She kept the green ring. She kept the name Calder when her father raged at her to drop it. And when Harlan Das told her, the third year, that he'd had word her husband died of the lung sickness at Stony Lick, she put on black and wore it a month, and then took it off and said she'd believe Eli Calder dead when she stood at his grave and not one day before. And her father struck her across the face for it, the only time he ever raised a hand to her. And she took our daughter, and what money she had honestly earned keeping his books, and she left. I didn't know any of that. In the stone box to the south I served my 12 years and then 2 more, because a man who keeps insisting he's innocent gets no good marks for it. And somewhere in the 11th year Vince Sorrel, who'd never gotten the range or the daughter and had taken to drink the way disappointed men do, fell off a horse drunk and broke his neck and lived 3 days. And on the second of them he sent for the sheriff at Cedar Bluff and confessed the whole thing, the iron, the brands, the lie, every word of it. The sheriff wrote it down, and Sorrel signed it with a hand that could barely hold the pen. And then the paper went into a drawer in Cedar Bluff and sat there, because the sheriff who'd taken it down was old, and the territory was wide, and a convict near the end of his term wasn't worth the dust of riding out to free. And nobody in that country had reason to think Eli Calder was anything to anybody anymore. So I served the whole of it. 14 years and some months, and I walked out of the gate of Stony Lick on a morning in late summer with a suit of clothes that didn't fit, and $3 the territory gives a man so he won't rob the first house he passes. And I was 36 years old, and I had a body that worked and a name that was clean if anybody had cared to check, and not one living soul that I knew of who'd take my hand. I stood outside that wall a long while. A man who has wanted only one thing for 14 years and is suddenly free to go and get it finds, in the moment of freedom, that he's forgotten how to want anything at all, and has to learn it over like learning to walk. I learned it standing in the road outside Stony Lick. I wanted to find my wife. Even if she'd married another and forgotten me, even if she spat in the road at the sight of me, I wanted to stand once where she could see me and say the words I'd written 14 years of letters trying to say, that I had not done it, that I had not stopped, that I had come back like I'd promised. And then if she sent me off I'd go, and live the rest of my life knowing I'd kept the one promise a man can keep, which is to come back when he says he will. It took me a year to find her. The Das range was sold. Harlan Das had let it go in pieces over the years, the way a proud man's empire goes, a section here to a debt and a section there to a drought, until the big house at Antelope Flat belonged to a cattle company that ran it with a manager and a crew of strangers, and the old man himself was living on the charity of a niece in a town 2 days east, sick and shrunk and waiting to die. Nobody at Antelope Flat had heard of a Marion Calder. A Marion Das, the manager said, frowning, the old owner's girl gone these dozen years he'd heard, run off with the child, and good riddance was how the old man had always told it. Where to, he couldn't say. I worked that year. A man tracking a ghost across a territory still has to eat, and I took day work where the country gave it, mending fence and breaking horses and riding line, and everywhere I went I asked after a woman named Calder traveling with a little girl, and for a long while the answer was always no. I aged a great deal that year. I'd gone into Stony Lick young and come out hard, but it was the year of looking that put the gray in me, because hope is a heavier load than despair, and I'd been carrying despair so long I'd grown aback for it, and hope nearly broke me where the stone box hadn't. It was a stage driver who put me on the road at last, an old whip named Pap Hollies who had shared a fire with on the freight road north of Cedar Bluff, a fire I'd built and a coffee he'd brewed, and we'd fallen to talking the way men do over a fire. And I told him I was looking for a woman ran a hard bargain and kept a green ring and answered to Calder. And Pap Hollies went still over his cup and said, careful, that he knew a woman ran the Larkspur stop up on Antelope Flat Road. kept it alone but for a half-grown girl and a couple of hired men, and that she was the hardest fair trader he'd ever changed horses under and wore a ring gone green as a spring pond, and that her name was Calder, Mrs. Calder, and there was no Mr. and never had been that anybody'd seen. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the fire Pap Holly slept beside, and I watched it down to coals, and I did the arithmetic of 14 years over and over like a man checking a sum he can't believe. And at first light, I saddled and rode for the Larkspur stop with my heart going like a hammer on cold iron. The Larkspur sat where the Antelope Flat Road bent around a shoulder of the Owl Creek Hills, a long low station of mortared stone and a barn and a pole corral and a windmill that turned slow in the dry morning. And as I came down the grade toward it, I made myself ride at a walk because a man galloping up to a stage stop is a man somebody reaches for a gun about. And because I was afraid, plain afraid, more afraid than I'd been at the courtroom or the wall. And I wanted to come up slow enough that I could turn and ride away if my nerve gave out. It nearly did. I stopped at the gate. There was a girl in the yard. She was maybe 13, 14, in a faded dress with her sleeves rolled, pumping water into a trough for the stage team, and she had a way of standing with her weight cocked to one hip and her chin set that stopped the breath in me, because it was Marion's stand, Marion arguing with the freight agent 12,000 days ago. And then she turned at the sound of my horse and looked at me across the yard, and I saw my mother's eyes in her face and my own jaw under them, and I knew before I knew anything. Before a word was spoken, before I'd so much as got down off my horse, that I was looking at a child of mine that I had never been told had been born. I could not speak. I sat the horse at the gate with my hands gone useless on the horn, and I looked at her and she looked at me, wary the way a girl raised careful is wary of a strange man, and she said, "Stage don't come through till noon, mister. You wanting to change a horse you can water him yonder." Her voice was Marion's too, the trade in it, the not to be trifled with. I got down. I think I'd have fallen if I hadn't. I held to the gate and I said, "Is Mrs. Calder about?" Something crossed the girl's face at that, a flicker, because a stranger knowing the name was not the usual thing, and she said slower, "She's inside. Who's asking?" And before I could find an answer that wasn't the whole of my life, the door of the station opened, and Marion came out into the light. She was 40 now, or near it, and the years had marked her the way years mark a person who works out of doors and carries a weight, and she was the most beautiful thing I had seen since the morning the deputies took me off the porch. She had a basket of wet wash on her hip, and she'd come out to hang it, and she got 3 steps into the yard before she saw the man at the gate, and she stopped. The basket did not fall. I want that put down too, because it would be a prettier story if the basket fell and the wash spilled in the dust. But Marion Calder did not drop a basket of clean wash for any man living or dead, and she stood there with it on her hip, and she looked at me across 15 years. And I watched her face go from a station keeper's wariness to something I have no word large enough for, and the only thing she said, in a voice gone down to almost nothing, was my name. "Eli." "It's me," I said, which was a fool thing to say and the only true thing I had. She set the basket down then, slow, like a woman moving in a dream she's afraid to wake from. She told the girl, without taking her eyes off me, to go inside, and the girl said, "Mama," and Marion said, "Lottie." "Inside," in the voice that does not get argued with, and the girl went, looking back over her shoulder the whole way exactly as her mother had looked back over her shoulder down a courtroom aisle a lifetime before, and the door shut, and we were alone in the yard with the windmill turning. For a while neither of us could cross the ground between us. 15 years is a wide yard. Then Marion said, in a flat, careful voice that I understood later was a wall she'd built brick by brick over a long time, "They told me you died. My father told me you died of the lung sickness at Stony Lick. 8 years back he told me that." She stopped. "Before that he told me you confessed. That you said in your own words you married me for the range and ran the cattle to spite him, and you were glad to be shut of me and the—" her voice caught. The only time it did, and the baby you never knew about. I never confessed to anything, I said, because I never did anything. Vince Sorrell salted that iron in my corral and swore me into prison, and I served 14 years for it, and I wrote you. Marion, I wrote you a letter every month I was in that place for years, and you never, and then I stopped, because I saw it land on her, saw the whole shape of it land on her at once, the way the last stone of an arch makes the arch. You wrote me, she said. Every month. I never got a letter, she said. Not one word in 15 years. And then her hand came up to her mouth and she said behind it in a voice gone to ruin, he burned them. My father burned them. He took the post off the wagon himself. He always took the post himself. I never thought, oh, God forgive me, I thought you'd stopped. I thought after the first year you'd stop because there was no point. And I told myself a man can't be blamed for stopping when the laws got him for 14 years. And all that time and she could not finish it. And I crossed the yard then, 15 years of yard. And I did not take her in my arms because we were not yet two people who could do that. We were two strangers who had once been married 4 days. And I stood close enough to see the green ring still on her hand, and I said, "You kept it." She looked down at the ring. "It's brass," she said. "It went green inside a month, you remember." I remember. I had a dozen chances at a gold one, she said. My father shoved Vince Sorrell at me for a year. After that there were others, decent men with land. I kept the brass. She turned the ring on her finger the way I'd seen her do it across 1,000 miles of memory. I told everybody I was a widow. It was easier than the truth. The truth was I didn't know what I was. I had a child and a name and a green ring and no husband and a father who'd lied to me about something. I always knew he'd lied to me about something, but I'd stopped being able to afford finding out what. She looked up at me. "I built this place," she said, and there was the old fierceness coming up under the ruin of her face, the freight agent's woman, the bookkeeper, the trader Pap Hollies had called the hardest fare dealer on the road. Nobody gave me the larkspur. I keep it. I keep it alone, and I keep it square, and I raised that girl in there to read and figure, and not to need a single soul she didn't choose to need, because I'd needed and been failed by it. So you understand, whatever this is, whatever you've come for, I'm not the girl in the courtroom anymore. I don't reach for the back of a coat. I didn't come to be reached for, I said. I came because I told you I'd come back. And I'm a man who keeps the one promise he's got left to keep, and that's the whole of it. If you send me off, I'll go. I just needed to stand where you could see I came. She looked at me a long time. The windmill turned. Somewhere in the station, a girl who was mine was standing at a window watching her mother talk to a stranger and not yet knowing. "Where," Marion said at last, "are the letters?" It was a stranger question than it sounds. And the answer to it is the strangest turn in the whole of this. I told her I didn't know, that I'd assumed they were burned to ash years gone, and she shook her head slow and said her father had never burned a thing of value in his life, that he was a man who kept ledgers of his own cruelties the way he kept ledgers of his cattle, and that if there was anything left of Eli Calder in this world that her father had touched, it would be where her father was, dying east of here in his niece's spare room, hoarding his sins like he'd hoarded his sections. And that she had not spoken to him in 8 years and was not going to now. But she said I might. She said if I wanted the proof of the thing for the girl's sake, for Lottie's sake, so the child would know her father hadn't thrown her away, then I might ride east and ask a dying man for the letters he'd stolen, and that she made no promise about what she'd do when I came back, only that she'd be at the Larkspur, keeping it square as she always was. I rode east. I'll not stretch it out. Harlan Doss was a yellow husk in a clean bed in a small house, his eyes gone milky and his hands gone to claws, and he knew my voice before I'd said 3 words, the way the dying know the one voice they've been waiting and dreading to hear. He didn't deny it. That's the thing I carried away that surprised me most. He didn't have a denial left in him. He told it all in that flat, dying voice. The iron and the brands and the bought judge and the burned letters, every one of them, and the invented confession, and the lie about the lung sickness. and at the end of it he wept, and he asked me a thing no man had any right to ask, which was whether I thought she'd ever forgive him. I sat in that small, clean room with the man who'd stolen my whole life and his daughters and his granddaughters, and I found I had no hate left to give him. The hate had all gone for the woman I'd built out of the silence, and that woman had never existed, and the real one was 40 miles west keeping a stage stop square, and a man only has so much hate in him, and I'd spent mine on a phantom. I told Harlan Das I couldn't answer for Marion and wouldn't try, and then I asked him for the letters. He had them. In a trunk under a false bottom his niece never knew was there, tied in bundles with freight twine, 15 years of them. Every letter I'd ever sent, not one burned. He'd lied about that too. He told her he burned them because a burned thing is gone and a kept thing is a weapon, and Harlan Das never in his life destroyed a weapon he might someday want. I took the bundle. It was heavier than I'd thought a thing made of paper could be. 3 days later the old man died, and his niece wrote to Marion about it, and Marion did not go to the funeral, and I have never once heard her say she regrets it. I came back to the Larkspur on an evening with the light going gold across Antelope Flat and the windmill throwing a long blue shadow, and Marion was on the porch, and the girl Lottie was beside her, and I saw that in the days I'd been gone Marion had told her. I saw it in the way the girl stood, not wary now but braced, the way you stand when you've been handed a piece of news too big to set down. I got off my horse at the gate, and I carried the bundle of letters across the yard and up the steps, and I stood in front of the two of them in the gold light, and I didn't know which one to speak to first, the wife I'd lost or the child I'd never had, and in the end I spoke to the child, because she was the one who'd never had a single word from me in her whole life and was owed the first one now. "Your mother says her name is Lottie," I said. "Charlotte," she said, "after your mother. Mama named me after your mother." And her chin was set exactly like Marion's at the freight wagon, exactly like mine, I suppose, and she was holding herself hard so as not to cry in front of a stranger, and I understood that hardness because I'd worn it 14 years in a stone box, and I knew it for what it was, which is the armor children put on when the grown people have failed them, and I'd have given the rest of my life to take it off her. I held out the bundle. "These are for your mother," I said, "but they were always partly for you, only I didn't know you were in the world to write to, so they don't say your name. They say I didn't do the thing they put me away for. And they say I was coming back. I wrote one every month for years. I want you to keep them when she's done with them, so that whatever else you grow up believing about people, you grow up knowing your father wrote you a letter every month for years even when he thought nobody would ever read it. A man does that or he doesn't. I did." The girl took the bundle. She held it the way her mother had held the basket of wash, not dropping it, a calder to the bone, and then her face came apart all at once the way a young face does, and she sat down right there on the porch step with the letters in her lap and put her face down on them and cried, and Marion sat down beside her and put an arm around her, and I stood there not knowing was I allowed. And Marion looked up at me over the bent head of our daughter, and she did a thing then that I have carried in my chest every day since. She reached up and took the back of my coat sleeve in her hand. "I said I don't reach for the back of a coat anymore," she said, and her voice was wet and steady at once. I lied. "Sit down, Eli." I sat down on the step below them, and Marion kept her hand on my sleeve, and the three of us sat in the gold light coming low across Antelope Flat, while a girl cried herself empty over a bundle of letters, and nobody hurried her, because she had 15 years of being thrown away to cry out, and a body can only do it at the pace a body can do it. I will not tell you it was easy after that, because that would be a lie, and I've had a belly full of lies for one lifetime. 15 years is not undone in a gold evening. Marion and I were strangers who'd been married 4 days and now had a half-grown daughter and a stage stop and 2 scarred lives between us, and we had to learn each other over from the ground, the way I'd had to learn to want again outside the prison wall. I hired on at the Larkspur first as a hand, sleeping in the barn, and Marion paid me wages on the first of the month, square as she paid everyone, and would not have it any other way. And I'd not have wanted it any other way, because the one thing that woman had built out of the ruin we'd both been handed was a place where she owed no soul and answered to no soul, and I'd sooner have cut off my hand than be the man who took that from her by being given anything I hadn't earned. So I earned it. I mended her corral and broke her green horses and rode the stage road and changed teams in the gray dawn. And in the evenings I'd sit on the porch and Charlotte would read me out the letters one at a time. My own words come back to me across 15 years in a young girl's voice. And I'd hear what a young fool I'd been and what a faithful one, both at once. And Marion would sit and listen and say nothing, and turn the green ring on her finger. It was the better part of a year before she came out to the barn, one cold night with a lantern, and stood in the doorway, and said she was tired of paying wages to her own husband, and would I quit being a stubborn fool and come inside. And I said I'd come inside the day. She told me she'd chosen it free, not because a girl needed a father or a station needed a hand, but because she, Marion Calder, who'd kept a green ring and a hard name through 15 years of being lied to, wanted the man and not the mending of an old wrong. And she set the lantern down on the floor of the barn and she said, "Eli Calder, I have had a dozen chances at a gold ring and I wore brass instead for 15 years and I'd have worn it to my grave. There's your free choosing. There it's been the whole time. You're just the last to read it." And that was the truest letter ever sent me, and it had no stamp and no ink, and it took 15 years in the mails, and I have never needed another. We were married again that spring by a new young preacher who didn't know our story, in the front room of the Larkspur with Charlotte for a witness and a jar of bluebells on the table, because Marion still would not be married without flowers, and bluebells were what the season gave. I had money for a gold ring by then. She wore the brass. The Larkspur stop stands yet, though the stages don't run anymore and the windmill's been still for years. Charlotte grew up and married a cattleman's son who was good to her and gave her 4 children, and she keeps the bundle of letters in a cedar box and reads them out to her own young ones on winter nights. My fool young words gone down into the 3rd generation now. A man's promise to a woman he thought he'd lost outliving the man himself. Marion and I had 30 years at the Larkspur after that cold night in the barn, 30 years to set against the 15 we were robbed of. And I'll tell any young man who will listen that 30 chosen years will not buy back 15 stolen ones. Nothing buys those back. They're gone into the dark with all the other things a hard world takes. But 30 chosen years will teach you that the buying back was never the point. The point was the coming back. The point was the green ring kept, and the letters written into a silence, and the woman who reached for the back of my coat after she'd sworn she never would. She's up on the hill now, under a stone I cut myself, and there's a place beside her with my name already on it waiting for the date, and most evenings I walk up there with my coffee and sit a while in the gold light coming low across Antelope Flat, and I tell her the day's small news the way I told her the freight figures 60 years ago, and I turn an old brass ring on a chain around my neck, worn green as a spring pond, and I wait. I'm good at waiting. I had the practice. And I am not afraid of the date that's coming, because a man who's once ridden a year across a whole territory to keep a 4-day promise knows the road, and knows that at the end of the longest waiting there's a gate, and a yard, and a woman setting down her basket, saying his name.